What if the quietest person in the courtroom turned out to be the sharpest mind in the room? What if a 20-year-old black man, dismissed, mocked, and wrongly accused, stood up and dismantled an entire prosecution with nothing but truth, intellect, and unwavering calm? This isn't just a story about a courtroom twist. It's about Malcolm Price, a young man who walked into court as a defendant and walked out as a symbol of justice, exposing bias, challenging assumptions, and forcing a judge to see beyond appearances. In a system where so many are silenced, Malcolm made the law listen. You won't believe how this case ends, but more importantly, you'll see why it matters. If this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell, because stories like this are just the beginning. The courtroom was already half full when Malcolm Price stepped through the double doors, hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, the 20-year-old looked more like a college kid lost on campus than a defendant facing serious charges. But the moment he stepped beside the defense table, whispers rippled through the gallery. A few spectators chuckled. A bailiff rolled his eyes. Seated high above, Judge Franklin Hayes, 68, peered down from the bench unimpressed. With his silver hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and decades of experience behind him, Hayes had seen hundreds of young men like Malcolm, or so he thought. Troublemakers, street kids, bold mouths with no discipline. He leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the polished wood. "Mr. Price," he said, voice edged with sarcasm, "do you even own a tie?" Laughter flickered through the courtroom. At the prosecution table, ADA Thomas Rourke, 45, smirked without trying to hide it. His suit was sharp, his confidence sharper. He glanced at Malcolm like he already knew how the day would end. Behind the defense table, public defender Erica Monroe, 38, offered Malcolm a quiet nod. But even she looked uneasy. To them, Malcolm was already guilty. He fit the story too well, a young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one cared that he had no criminal record. No one cared about the gaps in the case. What mattered was what they saw: a hoodie, a slouch, brown skin, and presumed defiance. But what none of them realized, especially Judge Hayes, was that Malcolm Price hadn't come here today to plead. He came to dismantle everything they thought they knew. And he wasn't bluffing. As Malcolm Price stood beside his public defender, Erica Monroe, 38, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt more like a bad sitcom than a serious legal proceeding. Judge Franklin Hayes, 68, shifted in his high-backed chair with the weary arrogance of a man who believed he had already read the last page of this story. "Let's make this quick," Hayes muttered, flipping open the case file. "I've got a tea time at 2. A few people in the gallery chuckled. The bailiff smirked. Even Ada Thomas Rourke, 45, couldn't hide the gleam of amusement in his eyes as he rose from his chair, straightening his designer suit like he was about to deliver a rehearsed monologue. "The state intends to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt," Rourke began, his tone dripping with practiced confidence, "that Mr. Price was found in possession of a stolen vehicle, caught red-handed, fleeing from officers. The facts, Your Honor, are not just clear, they are glaring." He turned slightly, glancing back at Malcolm with a look that said, "You're out of your depth, kid." Malcolm stayed quiet, hands clasped calmly in front of him. His eyes scanned the room. No one was taking this seriously. Not the jury, not the judge, and certainly not the man trying to convict him. Judge Hayes leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Counselor Monroe, do you actually have a defense prepared? Or is your client just here to waste our time?" Erica hesitated, opening her mouth to speak, but Malcolm gently touched her arm. "I'll speak for myself, Your Honor." That got everyone's attention. The chuckles stopped, and for the first time, the courtroom realized they might have made a mistake. A hush settled over the courtroom like fog rolling in from the Pacific. Even Judge Franklin Hayes, 68, paused mid-eye roll and straightened slightly in his chair. "You'll what?" he asked, peering over his glasses. Malcolm Price, 20, stood tall, his voice steady. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." Ada Thomas Rourke, 45, let out a short, dismissive laugh, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. Well, this should be entertaining. Erica Monroe, 38, Malcolm's public defender, glanced at him with hesitation but gave a subtle nod. She had seen the fire in his eyes during their brief conversations, something far sharper than what most of her clients brought into that room. Malcolm stepped forward with quiet confidence, every move deliberate. Before I proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to clarify a detail from the prosecution's opening statement. Rourke's smirk widened. Go ahead, counselor. Malcolm turned slightly toward the jury. Ada Rourke claims Officer Ruiz personally witnessed me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle. I'd like to request access to Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from the night of the arrest. Judge Hayes tilted his head. On what grounds? Because, Malcolm said, now locking eyes with the judge, Ruiz wasn't even on duty at the time the pursuit began. He couldn't have seen what he claimed to. Rourke's smirk faltered. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors leaned forward. Furthermore, Malcolm continued, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a subpoena request for those logs. Hayes leaned back slowly in his chair, rubbing his temple. This wasn't the performance of a reckless kid. This was a cross between a trained mind and lived experience. And for the first time that morning, the courtroom stopped mocking and started listening. A hush settled over the courtroom as Malcolm Price stepped away from the defense table, his posture steady, his expression calm but focused. He paused just a beat longer than expected, just long enough for the jury to shift slightly in their seats. Just long enough for Judge Franklin Hayes to glance down at him with barely concealed curiosity. The same people who'd been laughing minutes ago were suddenly watching him more closely. Your Honor, Malcolm began, his voice clear and confident, before I begin my defense, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Ada Thomas Rourke looked up from his notes, not bothering to hide his condescension. Go ahead, he said, arms folded. You stated that Officer Paul Denning witnessed me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle, correct? That's right, Rourke replied. Malcolm nodded once. And this testimony was submitted in his official incident report? It was. Turning toward Judge Hayes, Malcolm continued, Your Honor, I move to exclude Officer Denning's testimony on the grounds that he could not have witnessed what he claims. I request permission to subpoena the officer's GPS logs for the night in question. The room rustled. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. On what basis? Malcolm kept his tone even. According to publicly available dispatch records, Officer Denning wasn't even on site when the pursuit began. He wasn't anywhere near the location of the vehicle until nearly 20 minutes after it was recovered. That drew murmurs from the gallery. Ada Rourke sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is speculating. I'm asking to verify. Malcolm interrupted smoothly. I believe the officer's GPS logs will confirm he falsified his report. Judge Hayes looked between the two, then slowly nodded. We'll allow the verification request. Continue, Mr. Price. Malcolm turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe this case is cut and dry, but it's built on testimony that doesn't hold up. That's just the beginning. He stepped closer, pulling a printed exhibit from his file. Let's address the fingerprint evidence. The state claims my fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of a stolen 2022 Audi A6. That much is true. Ada Rourke leaned forward, anticipating a denial. But, Malcolm continued, fingerprints alone don't tell a full story. I never denied touching the car. I've said from the beginning, I opened the driver's side door outside a convenience store. It was unlocked. I leaned inside, curious, like any 20-year-old might be. I never started the engine. I never drove it. I never stole it. He looked directly at the jury. If you walk into a store, try on a jacket, and put it back on the rack, are you guilty of theft if someone else steals it later? That's what they're asking you to believe. One juror blinked and shifted. Another crossed his arms tightly. Rourke's lips thinned. Now let's talk about what's not here, Malcolm said. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, but they didn't bring in the specialist who analyzed the fingerprint lift. That means I have no chance to cross-examine, no chance to question the procedure, the chain of custody, or the possibility of contamination. He turned to Judge Hayes again. Your Honor, is it standard for the prosecution to skip key forensic witnesses in a felony trial? Judge Hayes gave Rourke a glance that spoke volumes. Malcolm let the silence linger. And finally, he said, perhaps the most important omission. He picked up a final document and held it high enough for the judge and jury to see. This is a copy of the original statement given by Raymond Whitaker, the actual owner of the vehicle. He was interviewed the night of the incident. According to this report, Mr. Whitaker said, and I quote, I left my car running while I ran into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy they arrested. The kid I saw was white. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I was arrested blocks away, walking with two friends after buying snacks at a corner store, Malcolm said. I never matched the description. My name was never connected to the vehicle until Officer Denning submitted his report, one that I've just proven to be false. Judge Hayes leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. The gallery was still. Even the court reporter had paused briefly. Malcolm's voice lowered, not dramatic, just deliberate. The prosecution knew about this witness statement. They had it. And yet, they presented a case to you without it. They asked you to convict me without ever mentioning the car owner said it wasn't me. They asked you to accept that my fingerprints on a door handle were enough for a felony. They brought no video, no credible witness, no motive, and left out the one person who could have cleared me from day one. He stepped back and looked at Judge Hayes. I rest, Your Honor. There was no applause, just silence, an uncomfortable, undeniable silence that stretched across the room. Ada Rourke flipped through his papers, trying to recover, but everyone saw it, the cracks in the state's case. The truth had been hidden in plain sight, and now it was center stage. And for the first time, Judge Franklin Hayes looked at Malcolm Price not as a defendant, but as something else entirely, someone who had just taken control of his own defense and shaken the courtroom to its core. The silence in the courtroom was thick after Malcolm Price finished his calm dismantling of the prosecution's case. Ada Thomas Rourke sat motionless, his jaw tight, papers askew in front of him, his carefully rehearsed confidence unraveling. Judge Franklin Hayes leaned back in his chair, a crease deepening between his brows, not out of anger, but something that looked a lot like realization. Malcolm wasn't done. He turned back to the jury, his voice steady, but his eyes sharper than ever. What happened here wasn't just a series of mistakes, he said. It was assumption, the kind of assumption that happens when someone sees a young black man and fills in the blanks before asking the right questions. A murmur rippled through the gallery. He glanced toward Ada Rourke but didn't pause. I was in the wrong place, wearing the wrong skin. That was all it took. No one asked where I'd been. No one checked the gas station cameras. No one even brought in the man who actually saw the thief. Malcolm gestured toward the exhibit table. Instead, they found a fingerprint on a steering wheel and decided that was enough. They didn't care about how it got there. They just cared that it fit the story they'd already decided on. He let that sink in, then added, how many other young men have stood here, told the truth, and been ignored because they didn't fit someone's idea of what innocent looks like? Judge Hayes's hands folded tightly in front of him. His expression had shifted from amused to deeply unsettled. Malcolm's final words in that moment were soft but unshakable. This wasn't justice. It was judgment. Before the facts, before the trial, before I even opened my mouth. But today, that stops. And just like that, the courtroom saw it too. Not just a flawed case, but a system that had leaned on bias and convenience. A young black man had turned their assumptions inside out and demanded they reckon with what they saw. The courtroom remained hushed as Malcolm Price returned to his seat. He didn't slump in relief. He didn't smirk in triumph. He simply sat down with the same quiet dignity he had carried since walking in. Across the room, Ada Thomas Rourke no longer looked like a man holding the reins. He avoided eye contact, flipping through paperwork as if the right page might save him from the wreckage Malcolm had just laid bare. At the bench, Judge Franklin Hayes removed his glasses and set them gently on the desk. The courtroom had seen him preside over hundreds of cases, stern, unshakable. But something in his eyes had softened. Something had cracked. He looked down at Malcolm, not as a criminal, not even as a defendant, but as a young man who had just commanded the room better than most seasoned attorneys. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Price," he began, his voice quieter than it had been all morning, "you were brought before this court on serious charges, and like many in this courtroom, I initially saw you through a lens shaped by assumption." A pause followed. The gallery leaned in. "But after reviewing the facts, hearing your arguments, and witnessing the way you carried yourself," he continued, "I realize now, too late perhaps, that you are not just another name on a docket. You are intelligent, prepared, and composed under pressure. Qualities we don't often see, even at this bench." He glanced briefly toward Rourke, then back at Malcolm. "All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice." The gavel came down, a sharp, decisive crack. As the murmurs rose around the room, Judge Hayes called out once more. "Mr. Price." Malcolm turned. "You ever considered law school?" the judge asked, a hint of a smile breaking through his normally unreadable expression. Malcolm tilted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Yes, Your Honor." I have. Hayes gave a slow nod, almost like a benediction. "Good, because the system needs more minds like yours." And with that, the courtroom didn't just see a case end. They witnessed a man of the system admit he'd been wrong. And that, too, was justice. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm Price stood on the steps, blinking into the afternoon sunlight as reporters buzzed around him. Microphones were shoved in his face, cameras clicked, and questions flew like sparks. "How did you know the law so well? What's next for you? Do you feel vindicated?" But Malcolm didn't answer any of them. He spotted his mother, Vanessa Price, standing just beyond the crowd. Her arms were folded, eyes brimming with pride and quiet relief. He made his way toward her, ignoring the noise behind him. When they met, she didn't say anything right away. She just pulled him close and held him like she used to when he was a child, tight, firm, and unshakable. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he replied. As they stood together, Malcolm looked across the plaza, watching people come and go. Faces passed by without a second thought. People living their lives unaware of how close he had come to losing his. He knew he had been lucky to have grown up in a home where the law was spoken around the dinner table, where his mother taught him to think, to question, to speak up. But what about the ones who didn't have that? The ones railroaded by a system that didn't care to ask questions? That thought sat heavy in his chest. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It never was. Malcolm Price had walked into that courtroom to defend himself, but he was walking out with something bigger. A purpose, a mission, because the system didn't just need fixing. It needed people willing to challenge it from within. And one day soon, Malcolm wouldn't be the one on trial. He'd be the one holding the law accountable. Malcolm Price's story reminds us that wisdom and strength don't always come with age. They're earned through courage, integrity, and the willingness to speak up when silence is easier. In a world where young black men are too often judged by appearance rather than truth, Malcolm stood tall, not just for himself, but for every person who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or wrongly accused. The courtroom became more than a place of judgment. It became a battleground for dignity. Malcolm's calm, strategic defense proved that knowledge is power, and preparation is the greatest tool we have against injustice. He reminded us that the law isn't just for lawyers, and that ordinary people, when equipped with clarity and courage, can demand extraordinary accountability. For those of us in our golden years, this story carries a powerful message. Our job isn't done. We may have paved the way, but the next generation is still walking it. We must support them, share our stories, and encourage them to keep questioning unfair systems. Most importantly, we must believe in them, even when the world doesn't. Malcolm didn't just beat a wrongful charge. He exposed a system of lazy assumptions and gave voice to the countless others who never had the chance to be heard. And through his resilience, he offered a lesson that transcends the courtroom. Never underestimate the power of quiet conviction. Let this story be a reminder that change doesn't always come from protest or noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, with a folder full of facts and the courage to face down a judge. If this story moved you or made you think, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment that matters.